Are we live? Yes, we are. We're live.
You are live. So how you doing,
Yeah.
man?
I'm good. Your office is looking better and better. It
I
looks
know.
wonderful.
Thank
Beautiful.
you.
Yes.
I'm glad we finally got, I got some carpet in here, which you can barely see. Maybe
Wow.
if
Oh, wow. Yeah. Look at
some
that.
carpet, better carpet. I had carpet,
Yeah.
but it was just like, it was probably 2 decades old.
Wow. Yeah. It was
anyways.
a white empty room. And then it went to like part of it was, had a little bit of brick and looked kind of like a Shawshank cell.
Yeah.
And now it actually looks like it's great. Looks like an actual office. It's fantastic.
Well, we had the I liked the brick. We were actually just planning on painting, and I was stripping away at the plaster, like the bubbled up paint, and it just started chipping. It went all the way down to the plaster, and then it started like crumbling. I thought, this isn't good, and this whole wall is going to have to be replastered. And then as I was like chipping it off altogether, the brick was looking cool, so I just went with it. I like it. It's different. Yeah. It adds some change into the office, and then I don't have to paint that whole side of the wall. So it's really just because I'm lazy.
Yeah, you are lazy. That's why I want to work with you. Because I don't have to put too much pressure on myself.
That's right.
No, you're not late. I remember you working really hard at First Pres. I remember that. I remember
that was like the only way. Honestly, that was the only way I could keep up. Everyone else was so much smarter. I had to study twice as hard and prove myself, but that's just just my own insecurities, I guess.
Yeah, I actually had a dream about Nick Reed last night. It was just kind of weird.
Oh, wow.
Nick, if you're watching, hello. Yeah, I had a dream that he wasn't wearing his mask. He was by himself, and then I waved at him. Nick Reed, folks, is somebody that we went to school with, and he went on to Oxford. He was one of the very smart ones.
One of the very bright ones.
Yeah.
And now as a professor
at RTS
Orlando. Orlando, yeah. Mm-hmm. So very cool. Yeah. I see him every once in a while. We run into each other at Twin Lakes Fellowship in Jackson, Mississippi, which got canceled last year, but they're planning on doing it this year.
Oh.
So I'm looking forward to that, catching up with folks.
I would love to go there. Maybe I'll fly down there again. Maybe we could all catch up. That'd be kind of fun.
It would be good.
All right.
So we got a plan.
Yes, we do.
Not a lot of time. We're trying to keep this a bit shorter because Peter's got to run. But
I got to go to CrossFit. I have to go to CrossFit.
Yeah, priorities.
Sorry, babe. You're listening.
Good way to get that.
I do have to run, but we also I like this because we're going to be doing a book review. But you jump right ahead. Yeah, if you want to tell the audience what we're.
We just plan on taking this book, Cynical Theories, which we've talked briefly about. I think we've at least mentioned that it's got a lot of good information. I think it was one of the best books of last year. Mm-hmm. Top 3 in my book, in my opinion. The other, I really like Gentle and Lowly as a kind of a devotional. But anyways, this was much more kind of cultural analysis, understanding the times. But what I really want to do as, kind of what would be unique, because we could just tell people, read the book, it's excellent, and you'll get a lot from it. But I think by reviewing it, analyzing it, and also applying it to our practices, like you're going to apply it in the way that this has helped you, or just, I guess, how, for instance, today we'll talk about postmodernism, how that impacts your practice, and then how it impacts my pastoral ministry.
That's great.
I think that's going to be the angle that makes it a little more interesting than just a straight review and an explanation of what we've read. But excellent book. I do encourage everyone to get a copy of it and read it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So
the opening, and I'll let you answer these opening questions, but like just think through what is it has an introduction where they focus on kind of bringing and connecting the ideas of social justice to critical theory. And I think that was kind of the emphasis here. So their goal is to address critical theories, which they call cynical theories, and kind of the vehicle by which critical theories is being seen in today's culture is through the social justice movement. Anything on the introduction that kind of stood out to you before we get to chapter 1, which is on postmodernism?
Yeah, no, I think it's probably just good to just, to say that a lot of the stuff that we're dealing with right now it's very easy to get lost in a huge mess, because when you are talking to somebody who may be of a different skin color and they get really upset with you because you may disagree with them, and they say, well, you're denying my lived experience. Right. That's a pretty common objection. And then immediately that kind of shuts you up pretty quickly, because it almost sounds like you're being pretty oppressive, or maybe you're triggering them, or you're denying their ability to see reality from their perspective. It seems very invalidating. I remember when I first, came across it.
It feels like it lacks compassion.
A lot of compassion. And as a therapist, I'm pretty sensitive to that. So that's why I think I struggled with it in the very beginning. Like whenever I would hear dialogue on the other side, that was usually the objection if I had maybe had some questions, or maybe if I disagreed. So I think he just kind of sets this tone on where these ideas came from. A few years ago, R.C. Sproul wrote this really good book that got me into philosophy called Consequences of Ideas. And it had a real profound influence on me, that there are ideas that still have consequences, whether we accept them or not, in our culture, that have been around for a long time, that we say, that we are a part of, that we hear. And it's good to just kind of settle down a little bit and just ask the question, where did these ideas come from? Why is this person saying you're denying my lived experience? Where did that start? And they just kind of set the tone that we didn't grow up in a vacuum. Our society has long history of philosophies that have integrated in the academia, especially, and has trickled down to the church, trickled down to the American Psychological Association, you name it, and is very, very ubiquitous, or it's inured in our culture. And so I think that we would like to spend the next few weeks just kind of equipping all of you and ourselves while we dialogue with people that on these very complex topics.
Yeah. There's really, I think they lay out the goal. The authors lay out their goal of, I think what you're already getting into, kind of the impact that postmodernism has had, for sure. But their goal was to simply guide the language and customs of this whole social justice movement, understanding the critical theory that is undergirding it, even if those who advocate for these things don't understand that it's critical theory, right? Because, and I think I was listening to an episode by John Harris of Conversations That Matter, where he was being interviewed about his book. It's actually on Ars Politica, which is another podcast I'd recommend you guys check out. Stephen Wolfe and Thomas something, I'm not sure the other guy, but anyways, they have an interview with John Harris where they're talking about John's book, Social Justice Goes to Church. And he's talking about just the kind of how social justice, I lost my train of thought for a second there. It's just the goal of, or just, I guess, how social justice has crept into the church without people realizing it. That was where I was going. Because they're like, I'm not a Marxist. I've never even read Marx. How can I be a Marxist? Or I've never read any critical theory, anything by these theorists, these French philosophers. Never read Lyotard or Foucault or Derrida. So how can I be a critical theorist? They don't even know what that is. And yet it's undergirding the academia world. It's undergirding, the media, the portrayal of reality. I mean, it's like it's undergirding society right now. And that's, I think, where what they're saying is we really need to get a handle on the language that's used, as well as kind of the various symbols that represent critical theory. So I think it's really, really an important read for everyone, and for Christians in particular, because we seem to be sort of naive. We listen to what someone says and we immediately want to accept it. And it's sort of, it comes kind of from the idea of listening to someone's testimony and wanting to be compassionate and listen to that. But it's like, if their testimony, if they're interpreting their testimony with a faulty worldview, then that needs to be corrected, not just heard. And you've talked about that a little bit. Some of your counseling, like the best things you can do is actually just speak truth.
Yes. Yeah. Or at least guide them in that. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't mind jumping right into chapter 1 if you want, or let's go ahead and do that, because we could at least implement or go back to the introduction a little bit. But I mean, I think it's good that when we talk about social justice, for example, that is a very packed word. And what do people mean by that? And so a good example of that would be racism. We've had some discussions. Our last discussion was with Monique. When people say something like racism or justice, what do they mean by that? And it really kind of comes from this new movement which is rooted in postmodernism. So let's just go ahead and define what postmodernism is. I mean, so there are two really good definitions here, but I think I'm going to go to the second one that he gives, because I think there are 4 things that we want to be looking at in the next few weeks. Number 1, postmodernism is basically a breakdown of the social construction of the concept of the self. So in other words, there is no sovereignty of the individual. It's much more focused on group dynamics. So that's why you would have LGBTQ is a good example of that. And usually people will have, as a social justice advocate, the assumption that they're speaking for the whole group of people. So that's one of the reasons why the intensity of the emotion tends to be so high and extreme, is because I am representing a group. It's no longer what I'm representing for myself or why that bothers me, but I am representing a group. And what you're doing, if you're disagreeing, is not just disagreeing with me, but all Black people or all lesbians or all gay people, Right. The second thing is that it's relativism from a moral and ethical discourse. And so morality is not found, but made. And morality is not based on culture or religious tradition. It's not like the mandate of heaven, for example, but it's just constructed by dialogue and choice. That's really what it is. So it's very relativistic. In other words, relativistic what I mean by that, it's every group for itself makes up its own truth claims. So I have no right. And that's one of the reasons why you won't hear a lot of people on the far left criticize radical Islam, for example. They're very uncomfortable with that.
Right.
In Iraq or Iran, even though they're committing like circumcision to young girls, because it's their own truth. So I can't necessarily go over there and tell them how to live. The third thing is deconstruction in art and culture. And maybe in the next episode, we could show some examples of how art looks like, but I would just encourage you to look at art. I actually teach art at Endicott. And one of the things I like to do is I like to you could actually look at art history from like the Renaissance and just compare that to art history in the past 30 or 40 years. You can go to the Modern Art Museum, which is radically different from the Historic Art Museum, because things are much more modern art's going to be looking at a mixture of high and low culture. And then the fourth thing is that postmodernism really kind of looks at globalization that people see borders of all kinds as social constructions that could be crossed and reconstructed, and are inclined to take their tribal norms less seriously. And so so they want to break down the boundaries, in other words. So it's good to just define that. But go ahead. Yeah.
Briefly on that. Sorry. The idea of globalization is an attack on any sense of nationalism, right? Any sense of appreciation or pride in your place, the place that you are. There's a push against that, and a recognition that we need to be thinking globally here about everything. So of course, why are we putting up a wall? We don't need a wall. Why would we have borders? Why would we have any kind of, we want to tear all that stuff down. So it definitely has political implications here. Some of the concepts he brought up, I think there's also some value in considering the previous definition, because those are the 4 categories that, like, I think are thematic.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, if you want to read that.
You do have the definition from the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is just succinct and gets at a lot of the other aspects that may not have been easily understood in those 4 categories. But a late 20th century movement characterized by broad skepticism, subjectivism, or relativism, a general suspicion of reason, and an acute sensitivity to the role of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power. So really, it's an overthrow of everything, right? It's skepticism about everything. It's a subjective view of reality that's based upon the cultural or the community context in which you're in. That defines it. And there's a constant desire to push back against the controlling narrative that's in power, because that's what defines power, is the narrative or the story that is describing, our current state or history. And so there's this constant desire to deconstruct it, right? Deconstruction is a postmodern idea, postmodernism. So this goal is to constantly push back against the major narrative so that another one can come up. And that's how you prioritize the views of those who are in the minority. Right? So there's a constant desire to kind of elevate minority views, which are oppressed by the major narrative, the meta narrative that needs to be deconstructed. But then what happens when that major narrative is replaced by the next one? Well, this one now needs to be deconstructed, right? This was kind of the goal, is to constantly be deconstructing, which we saw that in much of the view of even our review of Color of Compromise, right? Jamar Tisby and this concept of racism never really going away, always being present, and just constant. It's a constant thing. You have to fight it all the time, because another narrative is just going to insert its own view of racism, and it's going to just tweak it somewhat. And the only way to get a little bit closer to justice or a just society is to replace that one with another one. That makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and also I would add too that it's a form of, that's what was really well said. I mean, I think it's also a form of cynicism, even more so than skepticism. And I like the word he uses, because cynical is like, I'm kind of disgusted with something, and I'm cynical is also a place of like severe. Probably a lot of people in our country right now are maybe feeling cynical after what happened to the attack of our Capitol, because it's like the things that I once believed. It's a form of cognitive bias is being attacked. And so, postmodernism was, I have a lot of compassion for it, because it came out right after World War II, and you have 6 million Jews that were just killed in the Holocaust. You have a lot of people that were very kind of, especially leftists, who were oppressed by the communist regime, but they still liked the idea of communism. So then they hid in the academia. And then you have a lot of people that had these huge meta narratives, or were under these huge meta narratives, communism, Nazism, nationalism, and all of those really kind of broke apart. And so people that they were very cynical of these huge meta narratives, because it caused so much oppression. And so they built these, I think, what they decided to do is to go to the next step, which is look at plurality and to try to allow contradiction, to allow ambiguity, for example, rather than just strict dogma, so that we can dialogue again. And postmodernism, I mean, I don't think you and I could ever define it properly, because it's such a broad term. You have postmodernism, the Italian postmodernists versus the French postmodernists. But just for the sake of our audience, though, I think what the book really focuses on is maybe the more French approach that really wants to look at how knowledge and power, those two variants can really cause a lot of destruction. So even today, moving on today, so a lot of the people that we may be reading about race, or I don't want to keep, sexuality, whatever it may be, they're going to be looking at the power structures and the hierarchy. So white privilege, and this person's so all of that. There's going to be an oppressor versus an oppressed, and which that's usually where where it comes from, but it's a skepticism of the objective reality. So anybody that says I have somehow objective truth, there's a huge suspicion. And it's been that way for really since right after World War II, I would say. And I would say that's kind of the roots of it. So, and it still carries on today.
Yeah. And, one of the things you mentioned, you brought up, because it's sort of the cynicism about everything right now because of what's happened in the last few days, cynicism about kind of our deeply held political beliefs, at least. The idea, and this goes back to the introduction, but the authors talk about kind of the dismantlement of categories. And yet so there's this just a continuing changing of the narrative, a changing of the the kind of what we're pushing for. They call it the truth according to social justice. And so you're literally going to replace one thing after the other, and it's going to be an ongoing tension. It's going to be and that tension exploded in the last few days, right? I don't think anyone should be shocked that the far right responded to the far left. I mean, that was inevitable. I'm surprised it lasted this long. We literally went through riot after riot after riot from the BLM side of, from the left. And then on the right, you finally get a reaction and whoa, like the world is falling. The world is crumbling because the right actually responded and did something similar to what the left has been doing. Now, I know people would say, but this was exaggerated. This was on the Capitol. And I agree. They're criminals. They shouldn't have done it. And I think that's the obvious thing. But the reality is we have ignored the riots for 7 months or treated them as peaceful protests. And then when the right does it, it's like not allowed. So there's this rejection of non-discrimination of others. If the people that are in power are the ones perpetuating the discrimination, right? Or the ones who are reacting. So this concept, like what I'm saying is, if the right does the rioting, it's bad. If the left does the rioting, it's understandable because they've been oppressed for so long.
That's a fantastic point.
This rejection of an objective reality is what we're seeing. So,
well, anyways, and also because, well, you make a fantastic point, and the resistance also is, well, you all are in power, and you are, which is a terrible place to stand. Which is not to diverge too much, but I almost wonder we're creating two different countries at this point, and we are in a lot of ways, because you have two different realities. You have the 1619 Project and the 1776. You have a group of people that basically wanted to bring up socialism, defunding the police, whatnot, and all these kind of really interesting breakdown of cultures to start all over again. Why? Because the root of the problem is flawed, is completely flawed. And so we can't ever get rid of the root of the problem until we totally start over. And then we have the other side that says, no, actually traditions are good. Well, what's the assumption? The assumption is that even though traditions may have some bad things in their history, you still have this, quote, correspondence theory of truth. And what I mean by that is that you still think that objective truth claims out there are possible. And so that's why people who still want to uphold the Constitution, they're doing so, not saying that there's not, that our history doesn't have some corruption in it, but it's the assumption that our Constitution still has truth claims that we could still hold on to and adhere to, regardless of our own subjective lived experiences. So I think this book is very, very pertinent. And that's a fantastic point, because you're really you're passing one another. Because right there, you have two totally different assumptions of reality, and there is a lot of these old postmodern philosophers did have this kind of strong assumption that the reality that we're seeing is almost like the Matrix, what they call simulations, almost like, that these are, and this is what Lacan was talking about, simulacra, that these are just like copies of the actual original. And so the reality is that what we can't necessarily, the reason why everything is just, we can't have truth is because the truth that we see has been is no longer possible. It's no longer accessible. And, it's funny that this kind of thing has been around ever since Augustine. Augustine is actually, I'm reading Confessions right now. And, and that was one of the main arguments that the Mani were talking about, Manichaeans. That believed that this kind of doceticism, that believed that evil was somehow out there or good was somehow out there and was not necessarily in the physical. And so I think people are kind of, we have the same kind of tendency of that, this, that we can't attain truth. And so therefore truth has to be just what we find in our own lived experiences. So, I mean, I think that's a fantastic point. It's a very, very good point what you just made, because you're really, even if you're talking to somebody that has no understanding of philosophy, you're still getting people that are protesting. How dare you, as a white male, tell me as a woman or as a person of color that you have the right to protest, but I don't. Anyway. Well,
unless you're advocating for the minority, unless you're joining with the minority in that, because then you can have the right to even push back against like a conservative black man. Your voice will be heard because you're pushing against the dominant narrative that they've adopted. Anyways, it's an interesting. I think it helps to kind of clarify. Just the foundations, even if people don't recognize that that's where they're coming from, because it has become kind of pervasive in society. One of the paragraphs I wanted to point out on page 25 at the bottom is he says, this reaction often took the form of pervasive pessimism. You kind of alluded to that, this idea of cynicism. This pervasive pessimism that characterizes postmodern thinking, fueling fears about human hubris on one hand, and the loss of meaning and authenticity on the other. This despair was so pronounced that postmodernism itself could be characterized as a profound cultural crisis of confidence and authenticity, alongside a growing distrust of liberal social orders, growing fears of the loss of meaning caused by rapid improvements in technology defined the era. So you've got two movements, kind of this growing pessimism and fear of the loss of meaning, as well as the advance in technology, and just it created a crisis that really opened up the possibilities of this philosophical movement that really caught on, because they're, like you said, they were recovering from world wars that were devastating to modernist thought, because this was like fascism rose up out of kind of a Western civilization at that point. So the population, the population allowed a fascist to take power and to do what they did, and so that created this real kind of like, our whole world is caving. Everything that we've held dear has to be we have to reconsider it. It's to deconstruct it all.
Which is impossible, when you really think about it. And the reason why I said that, I love the word. That's a great chapter, and I think it is pertinent to right now. I mean, suicide rates among teenage girls is the highest it ever has been among men. Whenever I speak to suicidal victims, but people who have attempted suicide at the hospital, for example, where I've talked to a lot of people who've tried to attempt suicide, and it's a very, very powerful moment. It always has been for me, because they have, in my opinion, sometimes they are on the verge of knowing so much more than most of us really do, in the sense that there seems to be a disconnect to why I should keep going as I do when I have no underlying meaning to explain my actions. And I remember just getting in a conversation with a girl once, and she was just like, well, why shouldn't I die? Why shouldn't I commit suicide? And I didn't really have an answer for her at the time. I mean, because without trying to bring it back to Jesus, but I was just trying to do my job and trying to help her in the moment, because obviously I work at a secular university, not university, but hospital. So I couldn't, so what we offer in the what our culture offers by itself through the means of these kind of just pure individual, or excuse me, mandates, no, not mandates, but just like these, that there is no correspondence to something out there higher than herself, the transcendent. There is no transcendent. She asked a very good question. Well, you know, what else is there, and why shouldn't I just keep going? And there really isn't an answer. And I think that's why Albert Camus even said that, you know, the hardest philosophical problem that I've ever had to face was why I shouldn't commit suicide. And so, you know, I think there is a real despair, especially as technology gets greater and greater and greater, and we have the blurring of the individual in this mess, the blurring of boundaries, the power of language, the radical skepticism that's around us, that, you know, the inability to speak, to see everything in hierarchy and power structures, even though there's no meta narrative to explain where those powers or hierarchies come from, or whether or not they're good or bad, or why they should be torn down. I mean, that's the thing. It's like BLM just wants to tear down, but why? What's the underlining structure? Where are they getting that from? Who's telling them to do that? And are they going to replace it with something greater? And if not, with what? You know, why should we trust that? And so, yeah, it just keeps us going in an ongoing search of chaos, basically, which brings on the good question of despair, because despair is a real human emotion that we should feel when everything falls apart. It is a natural philosophical response you can't tell people not to feel. You have to feel despair if your whole world is falling apart, or go toward hedonism. Those are really the only two solutions when you're in total chaos.
Nihilism or hedonism.
Yeah. I mean, that's the only functions that I've seen psychologically that people have to go to in order for them to, quote, get better, to cope with it, is utter despair or hedonism, or, you know, or naivete. You know, it's just pure naivete, and just kind of doing this.
Try to be indifferent.
Yeah. And I'm sure there's another option. I'm probably not, you know, I'd love to hear from the audience if you think there are more.
That's the practical, but that's like your practical experience in terms of how people are reacting. But I think you know, there's a combination here, and I don't know where it is, but obviously, like, postmodernism is not the only thing influencing our current state of things. I think there's also a desire for a socialist kind of like a desire to replace what we currently have with a socialistic, communistic kind of society. They legitimately view that, at least like the founders of Black Lives Matter, view that as a goal, to become cultural Marxists, right? I mean, they are cultural Marxists, and to create a society in which there's total equality, right? Which is, again, an impossible standard or goal. No culture has ever achieved that, and to assume that we can it's really ultimately just going to create more chaos and more tension, because we're just constantly pushing back on whoever's in power, trying to lower them so that others below can come up. But, you know, who loses in that is the culture.
Yeah. I mean, do you want to share anything about just being a pastor too? I mean, you know, as you're I should say this, I do want to read the two principles, and then I want to ask you a question about just you as a pastor. Yeah. I mean, the principles are, and we're going to go over this a lot.
Yeah, let's go into that.
Yeah,
page 31.
The two principles. The first one is radical skepticism about whether objective knowledge or truth is obtainable. That's the first principle. We're going to be repeating that quite a bit. So it's radical skepticism, not just skepticism, radical. It doesn't exist. Number two, it's a belief that society is formed on systems of power and hierarchies. So that's postmodernism defined right there. Skepticism about objective knowledge. So again, my lived experiences or your lived experience, you can't trump mine. But second It's formed on power and hierarchies. So if you're lower on the hierarchy, your voice trumps those on top of the hierarchy. So it's a switch. So and the four major themes are the blurring of boundaries, which basically language, that's very important when it comes to language. The power of language, excuse me. And then the second one is power of language. Third is cultural relativism. And fourth is the loss of the individual and the universal. But we don't have to go through all of those. But basically the blurring of the boundaries is just that objective truth and knowledge are just not possible. As we've already said, the power of language, that's really going to be Foucault. So we're going to really look at discourses that construct knowledge. So how are you playing your knowledge games? How do you construct your speech and phenomena? How do you deconstruct? So he's going to be really focusing on words. So congresswoman goes to congressperson. That's all postmodernism, amen to and a woman just happened today. I mean, this is all over the place, so don't call me congresswoman, call me congressperson, all of that. That's all power of language, constantly, changing the pronouns, all of that. Number 3, cultural relativism, which is what we just talked about. And then 4, the loss of the individual. So what the beauty of liberalism, the beauty of Western values, which is what Cynical Theories is really trying to attack, is that I think that's the key right there, is the loss of the individual. So as a psychiatrist, as a psychologist, one of the things I look at is the sovereignty, not the sovereignty, but the locus of control for the individual. And I won't go too much in depth about that, but how can this person stop blaming, the outside forces and take responsibility for himself or herself? And so the loss of the individual is going back to the kind of the feminist mindset, which is we have to change the whole culture. And then when we change the culture, the individual then can adapt inside that culture and succeed. So that's all I'm going to say about the chapter, because but I would love to hear you and your thoughts. I mean, just for you as a pastor, what are your struggles? What do you see? And what are, I don't know if you want to share your heart there.
Yeah. Well, no, I appreciate that. I think what I would say is, for the most part, at least conservative Christianity, as opposed to progressive Christianity, really doesn't buy into most of this, right, postmodern ideology. There's nothing about it that really resonates with the Christian. Now, a progressive Christian might say, well, we can do something with the narrative. We can listen to those who are oppressed. We can listen to those who are kind of who have been taken advantage of, and we can elevate their story, right? We can elevate their lived experience and give them a platform in which to speak to the community of saints. I don't do that. I think what I want to elevate is the Word of God. I want to elevate some biblical principles and some ideas about showing compassion and love and helping those who are in need, but not to the idea that we would elevate the power or authority of those in need above others. It's actually, that's discrimination. That's to say that we should remove, it's the concept of putting the person who places the most in the offering, give them a place at the front of the church. I mean, it's that in an opposite way. It's like giving someone who's in the lowest position this place of power, which I think is just a discrimination. It's another method of discrimination. We need to be recognizing that, no, they have a place and they belong, and they should be a part of the discussion that we're having together. And we're all submitting under the authority of Christ and his headship. So as we understand more of, the truth of Scripture, we can begin to apply that into our context, and that will elevate our thinking to. I just
do you ever get objections with that particular, just being comfortable in the that particular hierarchy?
Well, I don't have. I do get objections, yes.
But what are their names? What are their names and addresses?
Yeah. Not necessarily from within the church. Like, they're more other pastors or other Christians outside of the church. I don't think they would want to And, I mean, if they disagreed with me on that, they would quickly find that their view is not the one that our church takes, and therefore they'll find another church that does. And there's plenty of them out there, unfortunately. I think that miss the purpose of the church. So they're not speaking truth; they're relativizing truth, and they're taking an approach that sort of like, let's just listen to. Anyways, it's like the Bible study. You go. There was a time where it was like, I don't want to go to a Bible study because it's like, no one knows what they're talking about, but everyone wants to talk.
Yeah, right. And you remember all the pressure you had to put on yourself just to say the most spiritual, give the most spiritual.
Right.
Answer? Yeah, I remember that. And I had to like end, my tone had to be like really, sanctimonious. Oh, yeah. And it's like, just think about what this is, Jesus. Anyway, Jesus is doing in my heart right now.
Well,
Monday night style, yeah. Monday night Bible study, especially. It was really hard when you had like a really huge crush on the girl, that was really hoping. Yeah, I was really hoping I had the most spiritual point in the room,
Yeah.
So I was young single man at 20.
Got some attention.
22 to 27. Very frustrated. Some hard years. So, anyway,
well, I did want to also say, within the context of the church, there is a bit of a threat in that there's an adoption, or there's an acceptance of, there's this assumption that we can kind of take some lessons from postmodernism and apply them within the church. So there is James K. A. Smith wrote the book, Who's Afraid of Postmodernism? And in fact, we read that. I read it in seminary. I believe it was in seminary. It might have been just after seminary. And at the time, I didn't really understand what he was doing. But there's a great. I'll actually share this because I think it's a helpful little. And I know we're about done, but I just want to share this. Can you see that? This review of Who's Afraid of Postmodernism. It's from the Westminster Theological Journal from 2007. So it goes back to then. But James Smith really presents, he pushes back. His thought is that really what we've done is we have taken these slogans of the postmodernists, Derrida, Lyotard, and Foucault. We've kind of created them into these bumper sticker slogans, and then we reject the bumper sticker without really understanding what we're rejecting. So Derrida, there's nothing outside the text. Lyotard is postmodernism is incredulity toward meta-narratives. We've been talking about that, right? This rejection of the main overarching universal narrative. And then power is knowledge is Foucault. And so the book is trying to say, we really aren't understanding these guys if we only take those mottos. We're taking them out of context. And so he approaches them and tries to say there's actually some value for the Christian. But what he ultimately does is he takes the concepts of, like, for instance, this idea of there's nothing outside of the text. And he says that, like Christians, we can rely upon the community for interpretation more than we do. And ultimately, what that is a rejection of our hermeneutic that has been adopted, or the grammatico-historical hermeneutic. This idea that the grammar means something, and that the historical context in which the author was writing from, as well as the audience that he was writing to, that has to be where we start. We start from that context, and then from there we begin to apply it, right? We can begin to apply it. Really, I would say you go historical-grammatical or grammatico-historical interpretation toward a redemptive historical interpretation. So you understand where this is in the place in biblical theology. Then you can begin to apply it to our modern situation, our modern circumstances and context. And but it's sort of a rejection of that, and it's the assumption that really all that matters is our interpretation of it for today, the historical context. So to me, there's some danger in. Sorry, I was going to try to find a quote from the
that's okay. Yeah.
Article, but
we could do it next. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Just to recommend the article and encourage people to look at that. I think some of the ideas of James Smith are definitely influencing pastors, and so postmodernism has kind of gone to church. In fact, I think that's what he calls that. What the subtitle of the book is, postmodernism goes to church, and he's saying we can apply some of this stuff. I think that's dangerous, and unfortunately, it's opened the door for our current situation more.
So, yeah, I didn't know that James Smith was open to postmodern. I had no idea about that. Yeah, that's fascinating. I always thought he was much more of a kind of old school sound PCA guy or something. I don't know why I thought that. Yeah, I do.
I know you got to go.
Yeah, this is great.
Fun.
This is awesome.
We'll pick up
next week. Yeah, what's next week's chapter? What is it? What's the name of it? We can get our audience.
You're gonna make me get the book.
No, I got it right here. It is going to be, folks. We won't do every chapter.
No.
And
this is postmodernism's applied turn, which we probably started to address already, but we could making oppression real. That's where it begins to focus on the power,
right?
The struggle for power.
Okay.
Eventually, we'll get to. I do think we should talk about queer theory, the critical race theory, gender studies. Those are really I
think that would be good. Yeah, at least those, and then social justice in action. And because we're going to have to be prepared for the next 4 years.
For sure.
Yeah. Oh,
I think this will be good help to at least.
Yeah. Please subscribe, everyone. And
yes,
so that we could at least
a review,
so that we could, and so we could at least buy ourselves one cup of coffee. We still,
we get no money from this.
No, we don't.
We are losing money fast.
One day, maybe we could pay for it. All right. Thanks everyone for listening.
CrossFit.
All right.
Have fun with CrossFit.
Okay. Sorry. Thanks.
Bye.
See ya.